So I will proudly introduce the next person, who was a student of mine between 2000 and 2010. It didn't really take her that long to do a PhD, but 2001. It didn't take her that long to do a PhD, but rather it was something where I was deliberately delaying her from leaving my lab because she was not only an excellent student, but also an excellent friend and member of my family. So she's now an assistant professor at Oklahoma State University, Monica Papes, and that'll take us on into the next talk.
Okay, so my presentation is going to try to present briefly two views of conservation action in general. So the outline for my talk has to do with two views of conservation, and then trying to reconcile the two, and then thinking about biodiversity conservation in light of what we need, what we humans need. Okay, so how, well, biodiversity conservation started before 1985, but it was more officially formulated in a publication almost exactly 30 years ago, published in December, a paper published in December in Bioscience by Sule, who was introducing this idea that we can use scientific process to conserve biodiversity. And specifically, he was talking about biology of species, communities, and ecosystems that have been affected by human actions. And then he was presenting some principles and tools for preserving biological diversity, and he also defined biological conservation biology, the discipline, as a crisis discipline, meaning that we have to take actions fast. We don't have information, the amount of information that perhaps we would want, but we need to take action fast, even though we may not be very comfortable with the amount of data or information we have. So this crisis discipline means that we need to try to integrate or make use as much as possible of information we have available. And he drew this circle of conservation biology field that draws information from different other different sciences, so integrating information from different fields, mostly biological fields, but also including social science and something he called eco-philosophy, kind of the thinking that we have about nature and what nature means to us. Okay, so he also defined in this paper published 30 years ago in December, he also formulated 4 functional postulates, and then 4 normative or ethical postulates. So the first one in this functional group of postulates says that evolution is at the base of community assemblages, let's say in a simple way. So if we think of species dependence on each other, keystone species, and how extinction of keystone species affects ecosystems, and species that have very specific interactions, tied coevolution. These are the kinds of evolutionary processes that he was mentioning or thinking about in this for this first postulate, functional postulate of coevolutionary processes. The second one had to do more with at what scales ecological processes occur, so thinking about different scales at which different processes are important. And then a little bit of genetics, the fact that, and this has been shown over and over again, that small populations are more prone to extinctions because of different genetic processes occurring in these small populations, and especially the random occurrences or the stochastic factors. And then finally, the point he made in this, the fourth point he made in this functional postulates was that for large species that require large home ranges, small nature preserves may not be the best choice. So these were 4 functional axioms or theories that he formulated in his paper. Then he moved on to these more ethical, normative / ethical postulates, and this is where we think more about our interpretation of nature and our reaction to nature, let's say. So simple postulates: diversity is good, ecological complexity is good, evolution is good. So not necessarily based on data or hard data or theories, but just saying that we enjoy seeing diversity. We think that ecosystems function well because they are complex, and then evolution as a process is necessary and a good thing to happen in nature. And then the last one was that biodiversity has intrinsic value, or a value that we cannot necessarily quantify, but it makes us feel good. So it's more of a way of feeling about nature. So this ethic principle of biodiversity and conserving biodiversity for the sake of nature, not necessarily because we have to, because there's some utility in it, but because it makes us feel good. Okay, so in sum, what he was saying was that we need to concentrate on reducing the rate at which we are losing biodiversity because of human actions. And he was hopeful that these small changes in rates of biodiversity extinctions over long periods of time will have a positive effect overall on conserving biodiversity. So what we can say is that conservation biology mission is centered on preventing biodiversity loss. We don't want to lose species. We don't want to lose complexity. So that's one defining principle of conservation. And then we want to do this for nature's sake, not necessarily because there's some utility in it, but for this ethical principle. Now, this paper was published in 1985. At the same time, Society for Conservation Biology was established in 1985. The first conference was held in 1987. And currently there are over 5,000. I read somewhere that there may be 10,000 members. I couldn't find a number, so I used the conservative one on the Society for Conservation Biology website. So there are a lot of us thinking about conservation and caring about nature and the future. Since 1985, a lot has happened. Having so many people interested and participating in conservation biology has generated new ideas, and some of them are expanding for this ethical and aesthetic view, or this idea that we need to protect nature for nature's sake because we care and we want to see diversity. So one of a faction, let's call it a faction, a group of scientists thinking about new directions and maybe branching out of the aesthetic view, has proposed a new terminology, let's say, or a new label, conservation science. So what is this all about? Well, first of all, this has been officially formulated in 2012. Another publication in Bioscience, the same journal that published Soule's vision on conservation biology in '85. And what Kariva and Marvir are proposing is that we cannot separate ecological dynamics from human dynamics. As Town has shown in his historical view of bird diversity in Mexico, the images of Mexico City Valley in 1800s and now are completely different. So our dynamics do influence ecological dynamics. So this is a point that they are making. Then another point they are making is that we need to try to have strategies that include both people and biodiversity goals. So we are trying to, or at least they are proposing, we should try to maximize both goals, not just conserving biodiversity. We need to think about the benefits that conservation provides to people. They also say in their paper that biodiversity conservation is still a crisis discipline, but since 1985, a lot of information has been published, accumulated, so now we have a bit more information to base our decisions and our management practices. And then last general idea in this context of conservation science is that we need to set priorities because we have limited resources. So unfortunately, we can't protect everything because we don't have resources, and we need to think in terms of what's most important, make kind of priorities or lists. So going back to, this was Soule's vision of conservation biology, then Kariva and Marvier provided their vision on conservation. So basically, conservation biology becomes one of the areas of conservation science. And what we see is that conservation science includes a lot of topics that are not biology oriented. So this idea of including more information that allows us to make decisions that benefit both people and biodiversity. What else has happened since 1985? A lot of things have happened. One of the most important one is that we've seen a 40% increase in human population. That is quite unavoidable, and this information, we need to realize it and take note of it. An immense growth in human population. And another point that they are making, Kariva and Marvier are making, is that we've seen a generational shift, at least to some degree, and in many countries, a generation shift where children are growing up in more urban environments, and maybe they are more dissociated from nature and from that aesthetic view of nature. So in light of these points, these two scientists decided to revisit the postulates published in 1985, and they came up with their own two groups of functional and normative postulates. So their functional postulates start with human influences are widespread, so being realistic about the environment that we have to act on. And this has been called also, our era has been also called the Anthropocene, meaning that humans' anthropogenic effects are almost as strong as natural processes occurring naturally without our influence. And then this idea that our fate and nature's fate, that these two are linked and connected, and I'll talk a little bit about ecosystem services. An idea of positive thinking, that some processes can be reversed. Nature is resilient to some degree, so maybe we don't need to be all the time pessimistic and thinking about crisis. And then this idea that we can try and we should be successful in avoiding overexploitation of resources. One idea they proposed was community-based management, and we can talk more about that. Okay, now in the normative section of their postulates, they shifted away from ethical views of nature to more principles that would generate more successful conservation outcomes. First one is we need to consider conservation action happening in nature, in human-altered landscapes. It's unavoidable. We are present almost everywhere, either directly or indirectly. We have indirect effects almost everywhere. In order to be successful in our conservation actions, we also need to be providing some sort of hope message that we can be successful to people. Because if we keep providing, if our messages are crisis, hopeless, everything is going down the drain, it's less likely that we will gain support from the general public. Their third normative postulate is work with corporations. This has generated a lot of debate, and I don't want to get into that, but that's one of their views. We should think about and engage corporations in conservation actions. And then again, try to maximize those two objectives for humans and for conservation. So maximize conservation and economic objectives, which is another highly debatable postulate. And then lastly, think about human rights. So instead of evicting people from an area to create a national park, do something that includes, have an action that includes, that considers human welfare and human rights. Okay, so in a nutshell, their view was that conservation must be about a future for people and nature, not just nature, so include people. We can be successful and nature can maybe hopefully survive our activities if our conservation actions sustain and hopefully enrich the lives of people. So again, think about people and how can we both help both people and biodiversity. And then lastly, I guess a strong message, they are advocating for conservation for people rather than from people. So rather than excluding people, try to include people in conservation actions. Another highly, I guess, debatable. Okay, so this idea of conservation for people, not just for biodiversity, has been explored with valuation of ecosystem services. And this diagram shows the four main categories of ecosystem services. At the base are the supporting services, also called habitat services. And then we have provisional, cultural, and regulating. Provisional meaning we are extracting resources. Cultural, we have some personal, aesthetic, or religious gain, regulating main processes and functions in ecosystems. Okay, so evaluation of ecosystem services has been increasingly used to promote conservation goals. For that, we need to put a monetary value on these ecosystem services. This is, again, a highly debatable topic, but it's a new topic, new-ish topic, and it's worth considering in this conservation implementation course. Okay, so yeah, this idea is we need to put a monetary value on or basically say how much in dollars, let's say, how much one particular ecosystem service values. Of course, this has raised many concerns in the conservation community. First of all, technology may become cheaper than the ecosystem service that we are trying to protect. So one simple example is we have a watershed that provides the filtration service. So water gets filtrated in this watershed. But if, let's say, a big resort wants to buy this land, and this ecosystem service is valued at some amount of dollar, we may be in trouble if a water filtration system costs less. So if technology is less expensive, that ecosystem service will be lost because, well, we just put a monetary value and we said, this costs this much and this costs less, so we are going to go with the least expensive option. Now, another more, I guess, basic science concern we have is that we haven't seen a high correlation or a strong correlation between species extinctions and loss of ecosystem services. In other words, we may be seeing species going extinct while the ecosystem service is still functioning. So in a way, we cannot use the ecosystem service to promote conservation of species. And this is one such example. So we have the number of plant species per a plot, and then we have the plant biomass. So this would be an ecosystem service, plant biomass, the amount, if we think about carbon storage, for example, to mitigate climate change, this would be one regulating ecosystem service. With high plant biomass, we have high storage of carbon. But what we see is that we have a plant biomass, a rather plateauing plant biomass with a number of species varying from 30 to almost 10, which means we could lose 20 species and maintain the same level of ecosystem service. So this is not good for a conservation objective. We cannot use this particular ecosystem service to advocate for arresting or slowing down of species extinctions. Strong messages from the scientific community. One commentary in Nature published in 2006 was titled "Selling Out Nature." And this was a cry and a call for returning to conservation for nature's sake, instead of conserving for utilitarian, for ecosystem service processes, basically for human benefit. So this was a message: we need to stop doing this. We need to return to conserving biodiversity for the sake, for nature's sake. And this idea was summarized here. We can make a strong message and more progress by appealing to people's hearts rather than wallets, than putting a value on ecosystem services. So this is one view that is prevailing in the field, that humans will react because they care about nature, about that aesthetic view of nature. They will be receptive to our conservation initiatives. Another worrying study that came out in the summer in 2015 showed that one well-used example of ecosystem service, valuation of ecosystem service, pollination, is actually not that great in terms of preserving diversity of pollinators. So what this study showed was that the level of ecosystem service is maintained by a subset of bee species. So if we want to protect a large number of species, and especially threatened bee species, we cannot use this ecosystem service, the pollination, as a message or a point to advocate for conservation. So in other words, a reduced number of species provides the ecosystem service. A lot of other species are not significantly participating to this ecosystem service pollination. So why should we use evaluation of ecosystem services? We've seen so many problems with it. One point to make is that a lot of people who are none of us in this room will have this view, but people who are not that caring about biodiversity and nature may be more receptive to a message that tells them what they are losing, what kind of loss they will personally experience if an ecosystem is degraded or species are lost. So for people who don't have nature at heart, this makes sense, because we tell them, you're going to have water that has low quality if we don't protect this watershed. Also, having a dollar amount or a monetary value associated with an ecosystem makes communication easier with people who, again, are not that interested in nature and conservation in general. And another point to make is that so far we've seen simplified examples of evaluation of ecosystem services. So if we try to make more complex evaluations of ecosystem services, perhaps this approach is not that bad or not that destructive. So one paper that tried to make this point, that we need more complex evaluation of ecosystem services, was published again this year. And this was a paper in response to a report that was published by WWF, World Wildlife Fund, and their report had to do with the economic value of Virunga National Park. So this was interesting because World Wildlife Fund was trying to prevent exploration and prospecting for oil in Virunga or around Virunga National Park, and we know it's a very iconic park. So what they were doing, WWF and a consultancy firm, what they were doing was to estimate the value, the current value of Virunga in terms of ecosystem services, and also put a potential value, basically ecosystem services that have not yet been used or had been valued in Virunga National Park. So they came up with a big number, over $1 billion, the value of Virunga National Park, based on direct use, so fishery tourism, hydroelectric power, and then indirect values such as carbon sequestration, as I mentioned before, water supply, erosion control, so on and so forth. So they made an economic valuation of the park, and they said, look, this is worth over $1 billion. If we maintain it, we are gonna, over many years, we are gonna gain $1.1 billion. So we should not allow oil exploration in Virunga National Park. Now, this paper that I mentioned that was published this year was not very happy with the way this economic valuation was made. So their point was, look, you just made use of one type of economic valuation. You just put all the emphasis on the monetary part of these ecosystem services. So what they are advocating is for an integrated approach to evaluating ecosystem services. So what this integrative approach means is that we have to consider not just the economic value of ecosystem services, but also the social value and the ecological value. So social values, basically values that Virunga National Park provides to local communities, and this idea that economic values and social values of ecosystem services are acting based on the functionality, ecological functionality of the ecosystem. So if we don't have a good functioning ecosystem, these two other types of value, economic and social, will not be that great. So this is the idea of integrating multiple values of ecosystem services. So, okay, so we've seen many problems, possible solutions. How do we go about trying to make conservation for the people as opposed to conservation from the people? One view that is widespread and a bit pessimistic is that development and conservation goals are incompatible. So we cannot, in reality, we cannot address or attain both objectives of human development of the society and conservation of biodiversity. And in this view, what is needed is large-scale actions, both in many levels, political, social, economic reforms at large scale. So these community development schemes, in this view, don't really do that much. We need large-scale actions on multiple levels. So that's one view. The other view is that development and conservation are linked, and what we actually need is the appropriate scale for these projects that include both development and conservation objectives. So this view argues that we haven't been done this at the proper scale. We need to find the proper scale, and different projects will be successful at different scales. So kind of trying to summarize here, the conservation projects seem to be viable only if we have these dual objectives. First, the ecological conditions, maintaining the ecological conditions, but also thinking about maintaining the local livelihood, so including people in conservation actions. This seems to be the way forward, having this duality of our objective. If you think this is too challenging, I give you a couple more to think about. This idea of sustainable use of resources for conservation actually does not, maybe alleviates poverty, but does not pull people out of poverty. So we need more than just sustainable use of resources. We need education, healthcare, infrastructure. Basically, this is not something that we conservation biologists can do alone. So what we can do is we can maintain ecosystem services for the benefit of biodiversity conservation but also for maintaining local livelihoods, not necessarily pulling those societies out of poverty. So we cannot solve it, we can maybe alleviate it while maintaining functional ecosystem services. Okay, so if you think this is a lot, I just say don't give up. Think about this. We are a slightly new field, so we need a lot more time and we need a lot more effort. We need to also think interdisciplinary. We cannot act in a vacuum. We need to think about social aspects, economic aspects, how we communicate our message. This is extremely important. We need to be very good about communicating conservation goals. And then think about this. We are here to stay. We are here to grow. Our societies will keep growing. So we need to be proactive and keep trying to preserve nature while we are also growing as a society. So that's all. Thank you.